Hey everybody. Today I'm going to be doing my tier list for the Worlds 2004 format. Now, I've spent a lot of time building, playing, and testing the 2004 format, and I absolutely love it. I think it's a really fun format to play. There's a huge amount of diversity in the format, and I think it is vastly under-optimized. I think there's a lot of decks and strategies that just haven't really been tested or built correctly. So this, I guess, is kind of a disclaimer here too. This is my personal tier list with my personal decks and my personal list for them. To be completely upfront, I would even say this is probably a little bit ahead of where the community is, just because I feel like I've spent a lot more time building, playing, and testing these decks than the community has. And a good example of this is a few months ago, there was a Worlds 2004 tournament. I'm not sure how many players were in it. I didn't get the opportunity to play in it, but James Arnold ended up winning the event playing Crobat Gorebyss. But while James' deck was really, really original, or I should say his own list, his own creation on it, a lot of the top 8 lists, you saw a lot of net decking, which I'm not going to say is a bad thing. But, like, for example, the Blaziken deck that got second was just a direct copy of Chris Phillips' Blaziken deck. And, like, once again, I'm not going to hate on net decking. I'm not going to say that's bad. I'm just going to say, though, that I think that really shows that the player base has not really deck built the format. They really haven't optimized a lot of the decks and a lot of the lists. So I think there's a lot more to discover and grow in this format than has been done. So I guess that's going to just be my disclaimer and I guess my opinion on it. So today, let's go ahead and just jump right into the tier list here. I do want to quickly break down how I define each tier and what they mean to me. So S tier decks here are going to be decks that are so dominant in the format that they just have a stranglehold on it, and even direct counters to the deck barely manage to get 50-50 matchups. Great examples of this is going to be the Gardevoir deck from 2008 that I covered on the channel last week. A tier decks are going to be the big decks of the format. They could easily go in and win a tournament. They also have really solid matchups across the board, usually are pretty consistent, and just all around great decks with very few weaknesses. B tier decks are going to be similar to A tier decks, but they're going to have some struggles. Maybe they take one or two bad matchups to bigger decks in the format. Maybe they have some consistency issues. They've just got something that's a little bit shakier than an A tier deck that just knocks them down a peg. C tier decks are going to be decks. They're going to be good decks. Yeah, they can take some games off A or B tier decks, but they are going to be noticeably weaker decks. That's either going to be in their raw strength or in their consistency, or there's just something that makes them noticeably not as good as A or B tier decks. And then lastly is going to be D tier decks. These are going to be decks that I've worked with. I've tried to get them up there. I've tried to get them into that B, C tier range, and that no matter what I do to try to build this deck or tech this deck or any of that stuff, I just can't get the deck to have any sort of strength. And that's not going to say that the deck can't win games. That's not to say it couldn't take games off higher tier decks. Just it's not going to be able to do it consistently, and it's not a deck that I feel comfortable taking into a tournament. All right, so let's just go ahead and jump right on in. Starting off here, Blaziken. Now, a lot of people for the 2004 format would probably call Blaziken S tier. I don't. I think there's a lot of things in the format that counter it. I think there's a lot of decks in the format that can take 50-50 and better matchups against Blaziken. But it is probably the best deck in the format, so I'm going to call it A tier here. Crobat, this is going to be Crobat Gorebyss. I'm going to call that probably a B tier deck. I think it's a really good deck. I think it can definitely take games off of the A tier decks. I do think it has some consistency issues. I also think that its matchups are a little bit more shaky than you see in some of the A tier decks. Kingdra EX. Kingdra, people try to play it having 150 HP and then being able to take 1 energy to copy either Horsey or Seedra's attack. And Horsey does have a retaliate attack on a coin flip. It just doesn't have the damage output. It doesn't have the consistency. I shouldn't say that. It does have consistency. It just doesn't have the damage output or the matchups to really be a great deck. I'm probably going to call that a D tier deck. I just don't think it's that great. Exploud, in my opinion, is probably one of the best decks in the format. The problem is it takes a really hard loss to any sort of fighting deck. And no matter how much you try to counter that, it's just hard. And yeah, you can sit there and play 2 or 3 Ancient Tombs in it, but you are losing so much in your consistency and your matchups if you're doing that. I am probably still going to call it A tier because I feel like it matches up so well against the format. And the only decks that it really struggles with are going to be pure dedicated fighting decks. Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir EX is a pretty easy A tier for me. I think it's a very dominant deck. I think it even has a slightly favorable Blaziken matchup. It does struggle a little bit with the huge amount of Gorbis in the field, but the ability to just plow through multiple Gorbises, you can get ahead on energy drops. Even those matchups, I think, are pretty close to even. Machamp. Machamp's a deck I've worked with a lot lately. I really like Machamp. I don't think it's an A-tier deck. It does take some rough matchups. It doesn't have necessarily the same raw strength that some of these A-tier decks do. But I really do feel like it can take a lot of games off A-tier decks. I feel like you can go 50-50 with a lot of the A-tier decks. And I do think you can probably win a tournament with Machamp. I've got Medicham here. This is going to be Lantern, Medicham, Gorbis. I am going to call that probably a lower B tier deck. I think it's good. I do think you have some consistency issues with it. I also think it just doesn't have the same raw strength as you see in some of the A tier decks. Metagross. Metagross is something I've been working with lately too. It's a really fun deck to play. I really like Metagross as a Pokemon. And there's a lot of cool tricks you can do with it, but it doesn't have a lot of raw strength that you see in some of the A tier decks, and its matchups are a little bit shakier than you see in some of the B tier decks too. So it's a really good deck. It's a fun deck, but I think it's just a little too low to be a B tier deck. Next up, we got Mewtwo, Gorbis, or Mewtwo. There's a couple different ways to play it. You can play Mewtwo with you can play it with Gorbis. You can play it just as a dedicated turn 2 Mewtwo deck. It's a fun deck to play, and it's not a bad deck. The problem is you basically max out at like 60 damage, and if your opponent sets up, they're just going to beat you. There's not a whole lot of way around that. I guess in a lot of as long as I get a semi-decent hand with any deck I'm playing, I have never really had too many issues playing against Mewtwo. Next up is going to be Muk EX. Muk, I like Muk a lot. I think it's a really good deck. It has all the contenders to be a tier 1 deck. The thing that I don't like about Muk is that it relies almost entirely on your opponent. There's not really any room to outplay your opponent. It's completely based on your opponent's setup and how they draw and what they're able to do. It doesn't have the same, like I said, outplaying ability that you see with other decks. And for that reason, I'm going to put it as a B tier deck. Though I could definitely see people saying it's an A tier deck too. Sceptile EX. Sceptile, I think, and this is just going to be straight Sceptile, I think it beats anything in the format except for Blaziken. And I just don't think there's a way to play a dedicated Sceptile deck that's going to beat Blaziken. So for that reason, it is going to be a B tier deck. I think it is a really good deck. I think in the right meta, if you go to a tournament, you're not expecting to see a lot of Blaziken. I think it's a great deck. I think it can beat anything in the format and probably beat it pretty consistently. But just taking that auto loss to Blaziken is going to put it into B tier for me. Next up is going to be Shiftry. Shiftry is another deck I've worked with a lot. It's really good. It's really fun to play. Um, it can be a little challenging to match hand sizes sometimes, but usually hasn't been too much of an issue for me. Push Aside is also a really good attack, trying to take advantage of some of the inconsistencies in the format. I'm going to put it as a B tier, but it's probably a lower B tier. Swampbert's going to be another A tier for me. It just has so much raw strength, raw power. Being fighting is really good. Being water is really good. It has 2 great types. It has a lot of consistency with that built-in Delcatty Magneton engine. It has the ability to accelerate energy through that Swampert, and then, like I said, Swampert EX being a fighting type. It also has a sniping attack with Crushing Wave, which I think is really solid as well. Next up is Team Aqua, just a dedicated Team Aqua deck. I'm going to put that in D tier. I think there's some possibilities there. I think there's some stuff you can do with it. I just don't think it's that great. Magma is going to be another tough one. I think a lot of people would probably say it's a B tier deck. I am going to call it a lower... I'm going to put it in A tier just because I played a lot of games against James Arnold and his Magma deck, and we were pretty much neck and neck on any tier 1 deck that I would play, whether that was Swampert or Gardevoir or Blaziken or whatever. We were pretty darn close. I'm going to call it a lower A tier deck. I don't think it's as good as, say, Blaziken, Gardevoir, or Swampert, but I do think it's an A tier deck. It's just on the lower end of it. This is Vileplume Sceptile. I did a video on this a couple of weeks ago, too. I'm going to call this a B tier deck. I think it's really good. It just has some consistency issues. I'm even going to say probably it's a lower B tier deck, high C tier deck. Just got some of those hands that I've gotten with the deck is just makes it really rough. Wailord. I'm sorry, Colin. I think this is a D tier deck. Colin Mall played the deck to a World's Top 8 finish. Phenomenal player, phenomenal rogue deck builder. It's just, I think as with the 2004 format, as you see decks get more and more raw strength, I think it's really, really hard for Wailord to basically just consistently be able to heal damage. And I think the biggest struggle for it is while it does have we'll call it a run attack, that you get to switch it to the bench and heal 30 damage off of it. Anytime you're actually hitting them, you have to have it in the active position. And I think so many decks have so much raw strength now that, yeah, if you come up and hit something for 100, and then they're able to, let's say, even hit you for 70, 80, 90 damage, I think it's just really hard to get 4 energy under it and then consistently be healing it off, or you're hitting for reasonable amounts of damage. It's not the worst deck, and it's something that I want to play around with a little bit more, see if I can work with, but I would not feel comfortable playing it in a tournament or anything like that. Walrein. Walrein's going to be a C tier deck. I do think you have some possibilities there. I don't think the Walrein Milotic deck that saw play in 2004 is going to be the way to go. I've messed around with a couple of different rogue variations of the deck. It just struggles so much with Blossom, and 50 damage is just not a great damage number right now. It's just so low. Especially with someone decks playing before-mentioned Blossom to heal that down. I think being water, I think having a good Poke Power, having a decent attack, are all things that are going to help it. It just doesn't quite have that oomph it needs to be an A or B tier deck. I think if we would have seen a Walrein EX come out of Hidden Legends as well, the deck would have been a much more dominant force in the meta, but right now, I'm just not seeing it. Last one is Wigglytuff. Wigglytuff, John Schminto grinded into Worlds playing a Wigglytuff deck. I messed around with it on TCG1 a little bit too. It's a C tier deck. It's fun to play. It's a lot of fun to take games off of people with it because you open it with Jigglypuff and they think you're playing a bad deck, and then you can do some crazy plays. But it's not as good. 100 hit points is such a rough number for EXs in this format. It's just enough to trigger Desert Ruins, but it's not enough to actually give it a ton of survivability. I think you're almost better off with 90 HP EXs. All right, guys. So this is my tier list for the 2004 format. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Post your comments down below, and feel free to share your own tier list as well. I'd love to see your opinions on it. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the video, and I hope to see you in the next video.